How could 2020 possibly get worse?
Yep. Here's some nightmare scenarios. Florida gets hit by multiple storms in quick succession. Imagine New York barely getting back to normal from coronavirus only to get hit by a storm like Sandy, except this time the federal government refuses to help due to the president's beef with the state. Or imagine New Orleans, another city hit hard by coronavirus, getting hit by another Katrina-like storm. Will the levees hold up or will they fail again? Also, how bad will the response be this time? Houston getting hit by another Harvey. Galveston gets hit by another Ike storm. China has been saber-rattling at all its borders. Taiwan is their most important unfinished business, culturally. Reign in the renegades who should have been captured in 1949 according to the CCP narrative. The CCP is led by a guy under pressure economically, and like all authoritarian rulers that come under pressure, he's resorting to militant nationalism to retain power. It's also the West's biggest test. Will they stand by and let a totalitarian power invade and obliterate a standout well-functioning democracy? If fail that test, then who's next? There's a lot of old scores China has to settle going back thousands of years. Where does it stop? End of civilization? Last time I'm from Finland, had to fight Russia, they were a crippled group of random people with subpar leadership due to Stalin's purges, armed with almost nothing because the thought of any real resistance was bonkers to the Soviet leadership. They thought taking Finland would take days or a few weeks at most. The weaponry used by Finland and Soviets was also pretty equal too. Not equal in terms of numbers because the Soviets had multiple times more tanks and planes and, well, everything really, but the weapons itself were pretty simple. Rifle is a rifle. There's a bullet and it goes bang. Tanks also responded to the simple ad hoc Molotov cocktails. But now we have gadgets and shit that make hostile ski troops not as hidden and all that. Also, back in WW2 Finland was a rural place with very little proper roads for the tanks and troops invading to use. We have modern paved roads pretty much everywhere now, so that tactic where all Finland is a forest you can't get across is gone too. Finally, 80 years ago we weren't leaning on modern electrical infrastructure like we are now. You take out a few strategic phone masts and power plants and we are bleeding hard. And you can bet that Russia has elite forces capable to do missions like that before you could really build ways to prevent it well enough. So even though I would be willing to fight for my country just like my grandpas or my great uncles did back then, please recognize that the variables are very different now and Russia has a decent and surprisingly modern military. I know the initial WW5 comment was in jest, but war is a shitty thing. Please not speak about war like it's a simple just take on those same wooden skis Simo had and go snipety snipe in the woods event. War is horrible. Several X-class solar flares that completely destroy global telecommunications, household electronics, and power grids all over the world, thereby knocking humanity back to the Stone Age. Asterisk insert whatever time period you think would best suit the scenario, i.e., 1950s, 1900s, 1800s, etc. Wait, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing to have happened. Edit. Several people seem to be focusing on the Stone Age part of the above statement. If it makes all of you feel better about this hypothetical scenario, I have struck out the Stone Age part and left it up to the end user to decide how the scenario plays out. Astronomer here. I wouldn't worry about this one right now because the sun has an 11-year cycle, and we are at solar minimum and there are no sunspots. Edit. I am getting questions about solar flares because there were a few days ago. Does this mean we are coming out of minimum? Short answer is maybe, but we don't know for certain. There were a few M-class flares seen a few days ago, but the sunspot that created them was just over on the opposite side of the sun and it collapsed and disappeared in the few days before we could see it, so it didn't last long enough to be even named. Further, I don't know if I would call an M-class flare large. They're definitely notable in this part of the cycle, but wouldn't merit much note during maximum type thing. Here is a good explanation of ranking solar flares. They're ranked logarithmically like earthquakes, so an M-class is literally many times fainter than an X-class. But more important, solar cycles are not perfectly ordered things. You can have random sunspots pop up and disappear in minimum, and you can have days at maximum with no sunspots. So this might be the start of the minimum being over, but we'll have to wait and see a bit for another new sunspot to form before we know for sure. And finally, even if it is over, these are minor flares and spots compared to what you get at maximum. If you want to read up on how crazy flares can get at maximum though, read up on the Carrington event in 1859, the strongest flare we know of on record. About 5. It's an 11-year cycle. That said, it's not a set your watch by it type of cycle and things can be varied. The last maximum was a record low in number of sunspots and they are getting fewer each maximum pick. Fun fact, our sun is also changing in brightness during this 11-year period a little bit, So the sun is actually an 11-year variable star. Smiley face. Edit. I am getting questions about solar flares because there were a few days ago. Does this mean we are coming out of minimum? Short answer is maybe, but we don't know for certain. There were a few M-class flares seen a few days ago, but the sunspot that created them was just over on the opposite side of the sun and it collapsed and disappeared in the few days before we could see it, so it didn't last long enough to be even named. Further, I don't know if I would call an M-class flare large. They're definitely notable in this part of the cycle, but wouldn't merit much note during maximum type thing. Here is a good explanation of ranking solar flares. They're ranked logarithmically like earthquakes, so an M-class is literally many times fainter than an X-class. But more important, solar cycles are not perfectly ordered things. You can have random sunspots pop up and disappear in minimum, and you can have days at maximum with no sunspots. So this might be the start of the minimum being over, but we'll have to wait and see a bit for another new sunspot to form before we know for sure. And finally, even if it is over, these are minor flares and spots compared to what you get at maximum. If you want to read up on how crazy flares can get at maximum though, read up on the Carrington event in 1859, the strongest flare we know of on record. June, hurricane devastates the East Coast. July, COVID runs rampant with states wondering if they should have opened back up. August, wildfires devastate the West Coast. September, Biden says something idiotic to hurt himself from winning. October, with COVID destroying businesses, the economy crumbles, stocks plunge, and we hit a deep recession, officially. November, Trump wins presidency. December, riots over the election spread throughout the USA after we find news of another country meddling in the election. China decides to take advantage of our weak situation and launches an economic war. For me and some others, yes, but there has been worse years in all of our history, as others have stated, and I'm not going to repeat what they said. I am looking at this from a subjective standpoint as to prove why 2020 is a shit year. Subjectively, for me this year literally kicked the shit further down the drain for me, lost my job twice, or I can't visit my family members who are on their deathbed, and barely scraping by. You hear about COVID-19 24/7 and just want to stop hearing about it. You are sick of the hysteria and the hopelessness. There always seems to be something new threatening the world every month, like fires, COVID, murder hornets, and now hurricane season. Not a good mix with COVID. There is nothing to do for enjoyment. Before you can say, well, there's things you can do at your house, you miserable prick. Let me tell you, there is only so much you can do before you get bored at the thought of anything, and everyone just wants this dumb lockdown to end already and doesn't care anymore. Everyone I know is burned out with this year and wants it to burn in hell like it deserves, and probably where it came from. There is nothing to look forward to as it's shut down. People have given up, more like forced to, activities that they enjoy just because of COVID. People lost their jobs, graduations, and lives of people that they love. I'd say 2020 is a top contender for the worst year ever, but doesn't beat the 1929 stock market crash, the 1930s, WWI, and WW2, but nonetheless a top contender for destroying lives and sucking enjoyment out of everyone. Dear 2020, go back to where you came from and let's just skip to 2021 already. Fuck you 2020, and I hope you rot in hell. 2020, the year of hopelessness and lower expectations. That's all, folks. I have to disagree, and I lost a grandparent to COVID-19 last month in New York. With no job, I finally got to do what I always wanted to do for the past 5 years, stabilize my home, spend time with my family, and learn to be the actual king, using Jungian archetype here, that I always wanted. I've come to learn how to install electrical fixtures, how to properly paint a room, how to bond with my family, learned my imbalances in relationships and how it is exacerbated by being in quarantine, got myself healthier with better nutrition. I thought this was going to be impossible since diet is so difficult to maintain, went back to working out since having a family, and started to write my own mythological story. I've lost my job and thought my purpose was gone, and I let down my family, but this gave me time to bring myself back to center and find out that the American grind is not what humans are meant to do. I just hope when this clears up, I can find something to do that will be an asset to me and not a detriment to my mental and physical health like my last jobs and careers were. June and July 2020, the economy completely collapses because some major corporations go bankrupt because of COVID. We see massive food shortages across Europe. August 2020, a catastrophic hurricane occurs in the US that is followed by a series of earthquakes across Eastern Europe. Some people believe the apocalypse has come. September 2020, a new strain of coronavirus that is similar to SARS-CoV-2 but has heat resistance and 20% death rate, appears in Middle East/Africa and ravages the population. October 2020, North Korea falls into chaos after the death of Kim Jong-un and a new radical leader rises to power. Meanwhile, the US is in anarchy because of the economic collapse and protests. November 2020, North Korea declares war on South Korea, as they want to create a new, Great Korea. America has to react, so American and Japanese troops are sent there, despite massive protests against the war by the population. December 2020, South Korea wins, but Seoul is mostly destroyed by nuclear and chemical weapons. China also doesn't want a US ally in its borders, so it strikes back, and we have WW3. A slightly far-fetched scenario, I know. American here. How do things get worse? Protests continue, just as rent moratoriums and other emergency measures for the coronavirus stop. People start to run out of money, and since they can't get work, they can't make any either. They take to the streets, and clashes between police and citizens become progressively more violent. Anti-fascists and white supremacists decide they want to get in on the action, and gunfights between citizens and police escalate in major metro areas. Hundreds die. The House passes emergency legislation to stabilize the country, but the Senate, under the inept leadership of Mitch McConnell, does nothing. The riots disrupt supply chains, food and medical supplies start to be in short supply, and more people die as the economy collapses. Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies. The Senate rams through an unqualified ideologue. The uproar that ensues makes the Kavanaugh shitshow look like child's play. Several senators who vote for Ginsburg's replacement see attempts on their lives, leading many of our legislators to barricade themselves inside their private communities and fortified homes, which the ultra-wealthy are already doing. The legislative body of the government ceases to function. All while this is going on, the virus spreads unchecked through every nook and cranny in the country. The healthcare system is overwhelmed, and hundreds of thousands more die. An election is held in November, but it is chaotic and disorganized. Millions are unable to cast a ballot, and the results are widely regarded as fraudulent. Trump declares that he will not leave office even if he had lost. In the aftermath of this, someone attempts to assassinate Donald Trump. They fail, and in response Trump declares martial law. The military splits into pro-Trump and anti-Trump factions. A group of Americans break away from the current makeup of our government, declare themselves the legitimate government of the United States, and announce their intent to fight the pro-Trump forces. We have civil war by 2021.